Damn, I'm looking good.
You know, the PlayStation 2 is widely regarded as one of the greatest consoles of all time, being the best-selling console that not even the PS3, 4, and 5 could top that, with a huge, amazing library of many games like GT4, Burnout 3, Tekken 5, Jak and Daxter, as well as Ratchet & Clank Trilogy. Now, while you can still buy a used PS2 and some cheap games, playing them on a modern TV is not the most optimized way to play these games. You might be asking, can I just grab an old-ass CRT just for the PS2? Well, not really, because there's even a better way to play these PS2 games. Let me introduce you to PCX2. PCX2 is an emulator that emulates PS2 games, and it was created in 2001, and to this day it's still getting amazing updates every day. So just to kickstart 2025, I asked myself, why not make a PCX2 tutorial? Cause why not? So today I'm going to guide you on how to play your favorite PS2 games using this amazing emulator. So let's get this party started, shall we? Now, in order to use PCX2, you need a PS2 BIOS, and how do you get the BIOS? Simple, with this FreeMC boot card, which you can buy on Amazon for a few bucks, you can run a lot of homebrews, specifically BIOS Drain, which, as the name implies, dumps your PS2 BIOS to your USB drive. After that, copy the dumped BIOS file to a folder of your PC and you're good to go. Now, keep in mind that PCX2 system requirements are vastly higher compared to other emulators like DuckStation and Dolphin, and that is because the PS2's architecture is very complex compared to other consoles like the Wii, GameCube, and the PS1. Basically, that means if you want to have a great experience, you need a very decent modern CPU. And no, that i7 CPU from 2012 isn't good enough. It ain't gotta cut it, chief. To check if a CPU is viable for PCX2, check out CPU Passmark and head over to the single thread rating, which is important for the PCX2. The higher the SDR, the better the experience. In the PCX2 site, it mentions the system requirements that you need. However, that is just the tip of the iceberg, as some games are different in terms of requirements, as some games are not as demanding as other games, given that some games push the PS2 hardware to its absolute limits. So, if you want to play lightweight games, a CPU with an SDR of 1500 or more is the bare minimum for that. But if you want to play those iconic titles like GT4 and Ratchet & Clank, you need a little bit of more power. A CPU with an SDR of 2600 and more is needed for an optimized experience. Me personally, I have a Ryzen 5 7600X which has an SDR of 4100, which is practically overkill, and it runs all the PS2 games that I have flawlessly, with widescreen and 60 FPS patches included, which I'll get to that later. You might be thinking, aren't CPUs expensive? Well, yeah, but you can find cheaper CPUs that are effective enough to run PS2 games, like the Intel i3 12100F, which has an SDR of 3400, which is again enough for all the PS2 games. And it's not just the CPU that you need to worry about, but so is GPU. You may be saying, isn't emulation more dependent on the CPU? That's true for the most part, but the GPU also plays a huge role, not as big as the CPU side, but still important if you want to play these games at a higher resolution. A GTX 1650 is good enough for a lot of games, if you want to play them at 1080p and not going over the top with the upscaling methods, as some games are really GPU hungry. Now that we talk about the necessary requirements, it's time to download PCX2. When you go to the download section, there's the nightly builds or the stable builds. And which one should you pick? Well, if you want the bleeding cutting edge features, then the nightly builds is recommended. The stable builds are decent, but with the nightly builds, not only they get updated regularly, but maybe the performance is increased, sometimes. So I would pick the nightly builds. Normally, if you're a Windows user, you just pick the download with the Windows logo, but since I'm on Linux, more specifically Kubuntu, which is Ubuntu but with KDE Plasma sauce around it, there's two types of downloads you can choose from, App Image or Flatpaks. I personally pick App Image since I see no reason to use Flatpak unless if said emulator has no app images. So I just pick app image. After that, create a PCX2 folder for the app image, and after that, click the app image to start the emulator. First off, it will ask where is the BIOS file. Click browse and pick the BIOS file that you've dumped for your console. After that, it will ask you where the PCX2 can search your games, and you might be asking yourselves, where can I get the games? Just dump them. You need to own legitimate copies of PS2 games, not to mention there are a lot of PS2 games on sale on some retro stores like CX in Portugal, which they sell PS2 games relatively cheap, around 3 to 5 euros each, though that depends on what region you live. Now, to dump your PS2 games, if you're on Windows, use Imagery Burn to create an ISO file from your disk of your favorite PS2 game, and now make sure the disk is clean, otherwise it might have some errors here and there. As for Linux users, K3B is a good option to dump your PS2 games to your PC. After dumping your PS2 games, make a folder for your games and make sure that PCX2 will detect that folder that you've created. After that, we need to go to the settings. First, we have to go to the emulation section, and we have to tick VSync, optimal frame pacing, and sync to host, which it will give you a perfect smooth experience while also having less input latency for your games. However, if you have a FreeSync or G-Sync monitor, you don't need to enable VSync or sync to host, because they will do that for you. In the BIOS section, you can choose fast boot if you don't want to hear that iconic PS2 startup, but why would you do that honestly? This startup is so fucking peak. Now, we're moving on to the good stuff. Which rendering should I choose? Well, if you are on Windows, there's DX11, DX12, OpenGL, Vulkan, and software rendering. If you want your game to look accurate and pretty when upscaling, I recommend using Vulkan if you're using a modern GPU. It's accurate and fast compared to OpenGL, which, while it's accurate, it's not that fast. If your GPU can't keep up with games that are GPU intensive, or if you have a potato GPU, then you can use DX11 or 12. But keep in mind that DX11 and 12 are not as accurate as OpenGL and Vulkan, given they don't do some graphical stuff well compared to the other renderers. What about the software rendering? Well, using the software render of the PCX2 will grant you maximum accuracy, but no choice using any upscaling hacks. On top of that, it will not use your GPU, but your whole CPU, meaning it will be more demanding on the CPU side, though you can adjust the number of threads you want to use for the renderer. Like I said, the single thread rating of your CPU really is important. You might be wondering, John, I only see software OpenGL and Vulkan. Where's the goddamn DX11 and 12 renders? Well, my friend, that's because I'm on Linux, bro, and the only choices are OGL and Vulkan. And believe it or not, OpenGL on Linux work excellent on AMD GPUs than on Windows, given the awful history of OpenGL and AMD GPUs on Windows. Yeah, remember that? Let's not talk about it. Also, if you have a RDNA 3 GPU like the 7800 XT, don't pick Vulkan on Windows because you'll get driver timeouts here and there. Therefore, pick DX11 or OpenGL. Look, it is what it is. It was one of the few reasons that I moved to Linux, among other things. Once you select your render of your choice, you can pick your aspect ratio. Normally, most PS2 games use 4:3 aspect ratio since they were released around the time that CRTs were still king, but a few of them had 60:9 widescreen support. For example, Gran Turismo 3 and 4 had widescreen support implemented on their games. However, recently PCX2 also has 10:7 aspect ratio, which is excellent given a lot of these games had a resolution of 640x448, which is essentially 10:7. Now, some games benefit from that aspect ratio, but for the most part 4:3 should be fine for these games. As for upscaling filters, there's bilinear smooth and sharp. Smooth is available if you don't want to deal with pixelated stuff, but it can sometimes be blurry on some games. Sharp is my favorite since it makes games look very sharp when using the original native resolution. Now, when using upscale, there's little to no difference between smooth and sharp. You can also enable screen offsets and show overscan, which will emulate the original PS2 look when you're playing at their original resolution. If you're going to play PS2 games with upscaling, for the most part, you will want these features disabled. Only use it if you want to experience that OG PS2 experience. Anti-blur can remove that blurriness that PS2 games have, and this is pretty useful if you want to upscale games and not having that blurry nonsense. As for the interlacing, this is very interesting. All PS2 games outputted an interlacing resolution of 480i or 576i if you live in the PAL regions. If you play a PS2 game on a modern HD TV, the results can be a mixed bag. This is up to the TV you have. Some TVs deinterlace games well, others not so much. With PCX2, you could choose with the interlacing method you want. However, you might leave this at default since Automatic will pick the best interlacing method for a game. If you wish to change the method, you could pick Blend, Bob, Weave, or MAD, also known as Motion Adapted Deinterlacing. Weave is very awful due to coming artifacts, Blend is very blurry, the best ones are Bob and MAD Deinterlacing. Bob used to be the best for the interlacing PS2 games, but ever since Motion Adapted Deinterlacing arrived, is now the best deinterlacing method for PS2 games, not to mention that Bob deinterlacing can induce screen burn-ins due to its flickering nature. MAD doesn't look too shabby either. You can also select no deinterlacing, but it'll become a mess. Use it if a game has a no interlacing patch. As for upscaling hacks, this is where the magic begins. You can upscale the games up to 4K if your GPU can handle it, but keep in mind that some games are more demanding than others in terms of upscaling. For example, Gran Turismo 4 and 3 are infamous for being demanding in some tracks due to how complex the lighting effects are in these tracks, which push your GPUs at their limits even in 3 times the native resolution. Personally, despite having no love lost for the original native resolution of the PS2 games, playing them upscale make these games look like remasters that we never got, which is always a good thing. But it can break some visual effects here and there due to how the PS2 was designed. Sometimes there are some visual artifacts at the edges of the screen, but you can solve them by using the crop function, which allows you to remove these artifacts, as you can see for example in Gran Turismo 3. Some PS2 games, when using progressive scan, for instance in Gran Turismo 4 or Burnout 3, they can produce dithering effects. Some people might find it annoying, others will find it crucial for the original PS2 look. You can either set it to on or off depending on your preferences. The blending accuracy. This setting can really affect the performance of your games. Nowadays, most games don't even need blending on full or maximum, since basic does the blending job just fine. But if a game doesn't look too good, then you can choose full or maximum. But beware, it can make your GPU work really hard. It's worth mentioning that DX11 and 12 renders don't do blending very well, in the sense that they skip a lot of visual effects that OpenGL or Vulkan has, hence why they are faster than these two renders. You don't need to take manual upscaling fixes given how PCX2 will automatically select the upscaling features minus the internal resolution and blending for you. But if you're an expert and trying to find the best upscaling setting for a game, then by all means go for it. The PCX2 also allows the use of post-processing effects to make the game look prettier. We have Contrast Adaptive Sharpening, which is used for making blurry games look sharper, though I will say that in my opinion, it looks kinda meh, as I rather use Sharp Bilinear, which gives very pixelated results. As for filters, you can choose what type of scan lines you want to use. Some of them are okay, but they are inefficient if you only use the original resolution, as well as using screen offsets and show overscan to make them look great. The shade boost can make your games look brighter or more color vibrant if you think the color of some PS2 games look bleak. As for the OST section, it's actually useful to check how demanding a game is. The best way to check if a game is demanding, take CPU usage, and this will show the percentage of the Emotion Engine, graphics synthesizer, and the vector units, which are the components of a PS2 console. If one or all these components reaches 100, that usually means that a part of said game is pretty demanding, either because how a game pushed the original console to its limits, or it does some stupid shenanigans that affects the emulator. As I said before, having a good CPU is very important for keeping these percentages low, but also it's worth mentioning that even the best CPUs around the market can struggle with a few PS2 games out there. Remember when I said GT3 and 4 were GPU intensive, mostly on the night tracks? Well, there is an option that can help the performance of these games. Head over to the advanced section in the game settings, assuming you have enabled show advanced settings in the first place of course, then go to the hardware download and select disable readbacks. This way it will improve the performance of these games or games that have tons of readbacks. But be careful, by disabling readbacks while getting a huge speed improvement, you also get visual glitches here and there. Therefore, it is advised to disable readbacks only on these set games rather than globally, hence why per game settings exists of course. The per game settings is really cool, not just disable readbacks that I mentioned before, but some games are way more optimized in some renders. For instance, in Tekken Tag Tournament, the game runs much slower on Vulkan than OpenGL on Linux. Not sure why that happens, maybe it's one of those PS2 moments that some renderers don't get well with some games. Controls wise, PCX2 could automatically detect your controller. Whether it being DualShock 4, Xbox, or Switch controller, it will detect it and also map the buttons automatically without you mapping the buttons yourself. PCX2 also has tons of patches for a lot of games. There are a lot of quality of life improvement patches, widescreen patches, and even 60 frames per second patches for games that run 30 FPS. Some PS2 games don't have widescreen support, but the PCX2 community has managed to create these patches for these games, which is super neat. There's also the No-Interlacing patches, which are amazing, since they remove that interlacing nonsense on a lot of PS2 games, and they look marvelous when upscaled. However, when playing them at their original resolution, they can look very pixelated. But for me, the 60 FPS patches are totally game changers for me, as they make games, specifically racing games, feel a lot smoother than ever before. For instance, Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2, Midnight Club 2 and 3 feel so excellent to play with these patches. With that said, depending on what game you're playing, using 60 FPS patches can make these set games much more demanding, both on the CPU and GPU as well. It doesn't end there. While some games like the Ratchet & Clank trilogy run at 60 FPS, in some areas they can drop to 30 FPS, which in the heat of battle can be jarring. No worries though, you can overclock the Emotion Engine CPU of the PS2 to get rid of these slowdowns. But again, these are hacks that while can remove slowdowns, they can induce some problems like game freezing or soft locks, so use it wisely. And finally, there's a question that is interesting. Can the Steam Deck run PCX2? The answer is a yes, with the big asterisk. While the Steam Deck can run PCX2, its CPU isn't the best to deal with the most demanding beasts from the PS2 catalog. Sure, it isn't bad per se, but its power isn't enough to run all the games at full speed. Doesn't help the fact that its CPU clock speed is 2 GHz for the most part. However, you can solve this by using the Power Tools plugin from Decky, which you can set the CPU speed to 3.5 GHz, which is a huge speed improvement, sure, but it can drain the battery really fast. Not to mention that a CPU is based on the Zen 2 CPU architecture, has a single thread rating of 2200, which can run most PS2 games, but it will struggle some of the most iconic PS2 games out there. So take that with consideration if you want to play some of your favorite PS2 games on the go. Overall, I feel like PCX2 is, in my honest opinion, the best way to play your favorite PS2 games on your PC. Sure, having your console and a CRT TV is nice, but CRT nowadays are heavy and expensive, not to mention that PS2 consoles can die eventually. That is just how life works, and I think playing PS2 games on the PC is really a great way to preserve these old games in the future, and had PCX2 not been created, the PS2 emulation would be a bleak future for all we know. I remember back in 2016, when I built my first desktop PC, and when I booted GT4 for the first time on PCX2, it felt magic and then some. I said to myself, whoa, playing these PS2 games at 1080p was amazing, and I wouldn't come back to the original console, due to the fact using PCX2 was much more convenient and made a lot of PS2 games prettier. And also a huge thanks to the PCX2 team for making the best emulator of all time. Thanks for watching everyone, and as always, if you liked this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more content. And I want to know about you guys, what do you think about PCX2? Is it the best way to play PS2 games? Or do you think the original hardware is still the best way to play PS2 games? Whatever it is, let me know down in the comments below. And that is all folks, see you next time.